I've always loved camping. For as long as I can remember, I've felt a special connection to nature. The forest, the smell of damp earth, the crunch of branches beneath my feet, and the starry sky that seems to wrap around you like an infinite blanket of calm. Maybe it's because, since I was little, my family used to go camping at least once a year. Those memories left a deep mark on me, and as I grew older, I began to seek more adventures on my own. Over time, I met a group of people who shared the same passion for nature. It was almost by chance, while browsing an online forum about hiking trails, that I found a call for a group that camped monthly in different locations. It was the kind of thing I had always dreamed of, exploring increasingly remote places, surrounded by people who, like me, loved being in touch with nature. After joining the group and going on a couple of outings, everything seemed perfect. But that illusion of perfection would be shattered in a way I never imagined. It was the third trip I took with them, a large group of about 15 people. The leader, David, a man in his 40s with a scruffy beard and a charismatic personality, had chosen a place much more isolated than before. According to him, this forest, located more than 200 kilometers from the city, was one of the few places that had yet to be fully explored. Civilization hasn't reached here, he told us as we drove to the site, almost with a smile on his lips. To me, that sounded ideal. A place without cell signals, no nearby roads, no noisy tourists, just us and the vastness of the forest. When we arrived, the first thing that caught my attention was how dense the place was. The trees, tall and old, formed a natural canopy so thick that you could barely see the sky. And the silence, it was different. There was something in that silence that didn't resemble the forests I knew. It wasn't the calm, relaxing silence of other places. It was rather a heavy, dense silence, as if the forest was watching us, waiting for something. We began setting up camp. David assigned tasks and soon everything was in place. The tents lined up, the campfire crackling, and the group laughing and chatting as we prepared dinner. The first few hours were normal, even relaxing. We talked, ate, shared stories of past camping trips, and when fatigue began to show, one by one, we retreated to our tents. But that night wasn't like the others. I was sleeping soundly when a noise woke me up. At first I thought it was an animal moving among the trees, but the sound was more deliberate, like footsteps. I tried to listen more closely, holding my breath. It was hard to say, but it seemed like someone was walking around my tent. I slowly sat up, trying not to make any noise, and listened more carefully. The steps were soft, as if whoever was there didn't want to be detected. My mind started racing. One of my companions? A larger animal than expected? I looked around inside the tent, searching for a flashlight or something to defend myself with if necessary. The sound stopped suddenly and everything went silent again. My heart pounded in my chest, and I waited a few more minutes on high alert. There was nothing else, so eventually I convinced myself that it wasn't anything serious. Maybe someone from the camp had gone to relieve themselves, and the sound had startled me more than necessary. The next morning I didn't mention what had happened. I thought it would be an overreaction, and I didn't want to seem like the newbie of the group who got scared by everything. We decided to go for a hike to a nearby stream, one of the main reasons we had chosen that spot. While walking along the trail, enjoying the sunlight filtering through the trees, I lagged behind a bit, distracted by some curious plants I found along the way. When I looked up again, the others were quite far ahead. I quickened my pace, but then something caught my attention in the dense vegetation off the path. It was a cabin. A small, dilapidated wooden cabin, barely visible among the trees. It looked like it had been there for years, forgotten by everyone. I paused for a moment, assessing the situation. None of the group had mentioned seeing that cabin before, and none of the guides I had reviewed said anything about constructions in this area. Curiosity got the best of me. There was something mysterious about that place, and although part of me warned that I should keep going with the group, another part, perhaps more reckless, decided to approach. Slowly I pushed the door of the cabin. To my surprise, it opened easily with a creak. The inside was dark and dusty, but it didn't look like it had been inhabited recently. Despite that, there was a strange sense of unease in the air. I stood in the doorway for a few seconds, debating whether I should go in or not. In the end, curiosity won. I took a step inside, surveying the surroundings. There was an old wooden table, some chairs, and what looked like a broken shelf with objects I couldn't quite make out. The atmosphere was suffocating, as if the air hadn't circulated in a long time. Suddenly, a loud bang made me spin around. The door had slammed shut. I quickly approached it, thinking the wind might have pushed it, but when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. It was locked. I pushed harder, feeling the anxiety start to rise within me. But it wouldn't move. I was trapped. My heart began pounding as I tried to control the panic. It was then that I heard something that chilled me to the bone, a hiss, not just one, but several. I looked down and saw them, or rather, I saw them. 3 snakes moving slowly across the cabin floor. My entire body froze. The fear was paralyzing. I had never had an irrational fear of snakes, but being trapped in a locked cabin with 3 of them approaching was a nightmare. I tried to back away from them, but the cabin was so small that there wasn't much room to move. The snakes advanced, slithering with that hypnotic motion that made my mind focus on one thing. I shouldn't make any sudden movements. I had to stay calm. But how could I stay calm when I felt like my life was in danger? I tried again to open the door, this time with more desperation, but it didn't budge an inch. Something or someone had blocked it from the outside. How was that possible? Who had locked me in here, and why? With the snakes getting closer and closer, I felt like the desperation was overwhelming me. I was trapped, in the middle of nowhere, with no one knowing where I was. If I didn't do something soon, I wouldn't get out of this cabin alive. The air inside the cabin felt thick, filled with dust and fear. My breathing was fast and shallow, and even though I tried to stay still, every passing second made me feel like the snakes were getting closer. 3 snakes weren't a lot, but in that small space I felt surrounded. It seemed like they were measuring my movements, advancing slowly, as if they were studying me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The hissing of their tongues sliced through the air, echoing in my ears as if amplified. Suddenly the floor creaked under my feet, and one of them, the closest one, stopped abruptly, lifting its head, watching me with those small, cold eyes. My heart leaped in my chest. I held my breath, trying not to move a muscle. Time seemed to stop as the snake watched me, swaying its head as if deciding what to do with me. My eyes were fixed on the door. I needed to get out of there, but every attempt to open it had been futile. The adrenaline made my whole body tremble, and I had to fight not to give up. I couldn't stay there much longer. The thoughts of what might happen began to invade my mind. My only hope was that someone from the camp would realize I had fallen behind and come looking for me, but I had no idea how much time had passed since I had separated from the group. Maybe they had already moved on, thinking I was just exploring on my own. I tried shouting for help once more, this time with all my strength. My voice broke at first, but I managed to let out a desperate scream. "Help! Please, someone help me!" My cries echoed in the silence of the cabin, bouncing off the wooden walls, but outside everything remained completely silent. Had they heard me, or had the forest absorbed my screams, leaving me trapped in this nightmare? One of the snakes slithered even closer, its scales scraping the floor with that distinctive sound that made my skin crawl. I couldn't back up any farther. I was in the farthest corner of the cabin, pressed against a wall that felt cold and damp against my back. At that moment, I felt something moving outside the cabin. A creak, like someone walking nearby. My heart skipped a beat. Was someone there? Maybe someone had heard my screams. "I'm here, please help me," I shouted again, this time with more desperation. The sound of footsteps outside the cabin grew louder, but there didn't seem to be any hurry in them. It wasn't as if someone was running to rescue me, but rather like someone was walking calmly around the place, almost inspecting it. The fear inside me intensified. What if it wasn't one of the camp members? What if it was someone else, someone who had locked me in here in the first place? The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, listening intently. Everything was silent. Then the door, which I hadn't been able to move, began to creak slowly. It was opening. A sliver of light seeped through the crack, illuminating the dark interior of the cabin, and for a moment, relief washed over me. But then, the door stopped halfway. No one entered. Whoever was outside had simply opened the door just enough to leave it ajar. My hands trembled as I slowly stood up, my eyes fixed on the door, trying to peek out to see who was outside. But before I could approach, a dark shadow appeared in the doorway, blocking the light. I froze. I couldn't clearly see who it was. I only saw the silhouette of a person standing still, watching me from the darkness. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice trembling. There was no response. The silence was deafening, and the fear consumed me. I took a step back, moving away from the door and from the snakes that, to my horror, also seemed restless. They moved more quickly now, as if the opening of the door had altered their behavior. My eyes darted between the shadow in the doorway and the snakes on the floor, unsure of what was worse. "Please, help me," I insisted. Finally, the figure spoke, but their voice was low, barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have come in here." My mind tried to process what I was hearing. I didn't recognize the voice. It wasn't David nor any of the other camp members. Who was this person? Why were they saying that to me? "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice even weaker. Instead of responding, the figure stepped away and the door slammed shut once again. The sound echoed like a final blow to my sanity. I was trapped again, but now I knew I wasn't alone in that forest. Someone was watching me, and that someone had decided to play with me. Desperation hit me hard. I felt like I was on the verge of collapse. What did that person want? Why had they locked me in? Why wouldn't they let me out? As those questions raced through my mind, the snakes seemed to have regained their interest in me, moving slowly toward where I was huddled. I couldn't stay there, but I couldn't face whoever was outside either. I mustered up the courage and approached the door again, this time with more force. I pushed with all my strength, screaming and pounding. "Let me out! Help!" I knew my only option was to attract the attention of someone from the camp, someone who could hear me and rescue me. Minutes passed, and panic began to turn into despair. Each time I hit the door, I felt the echo of my blows disappear into the emptiness of the forest. There was no response. Fear and adrenaline coursed through me, and with every blow I gave, I felt weaker, more helpless. The snakes, still nearby, kept moving slowly across the floor, but now they seemed to ignore me, as if they knew I wasn't the real danger in that cabin. Suddenly I heard a new sound, this time louder and closer. It was the unmistakable crunch of branches and leaves being trampled, and then a familiar voice. "Amanda! Are you here, Amanda?" It was David. My entire body relaxed a little upon hearing his voice. "David, I'm trapped. Please help me." The footsteps quickly approached. I pounded the door once more, and this time the response was immediate. The wood creaked, and after a strong push, the door flew open. David stood there, his face a mixture of concern and relief at the sight of me. "What happened? Are you okay?" he asked as he helped me out. I stumbled out, my body trembling from the accumulated tension. "I don't know. The door. Someone locked me in here. And the snakes." David looked inside the cabin and frowned. "Snakes? Are you sure?" I nodded, still too shocked to articulate more words. However, when we both looked into the cabin, the snakes were gone. There was no trace of them. The fear surged inside me again. What was happening? "We have to get out of here," I said with a trembling voice. But inside, one persistent question gnawed at me. Who had locked me in there? Had it been someone from the camp? Or maybe someone else? Someone who lived in that forest and had been watching us from the shadows. David nodded and helped me back to camp, but I knew the worst was far from over. The walk back to camp felt endless. Despite David helping me walk, my mind couldn't stop replaying what had just happened. Who had locked me in that cabin? Had it been a cruel prank by one of the group members or something much darker? The images of the snakes slithering on the floor and the shadow in the doorway were still fresh in my mind. Nothing I had experienced up to that point made sense. As we approached the camp, I could hear the voices of the others. They were all gathered around the fire, chatting calmly as if nothing had happened. The contrast between the relaxed atmosphere of the group and the horror I had just lived through felt almost surreal. I felt a twinge of anger seeing them there, so carefree, while I had been on the verge of panic. But I couldn't blame them. None of them knew what had happened. Or did they? When David and I reached the clearing, the conversation stopped. Several gazes turned toward me, filled with curiosity and confusion. I felt the weight of all those stares, and my mind couldn't help but suspect each of them. Had someone here been responsible for what had happened to me? Before I could say anything, Sarah, one of the campmates I had spoken with a few times, quickly approached. Her face was filled with genuine concern. "Amanda, are you okay? We were looking for you. We thought you had fallen behind, but David said you went off to explore on your own." I tried to respond, but my voice came out weak and broken. "I found a cabin, and someone locked me inside. There were snakes." There was an uncomfortable silence as everyone absorbed my words. The disbelief was reflected on their faces. Even David, who had rescued me, seemed a bit skeptical, though he hid it better than the others. One of the guys, Tomas, who had always been a bit distant and reserved, let out a nervous laugh. Snakes? Come on, Amanda. Maybe you were just scared of the dark. This forest is old. It has lots of legends. Tomas's comment infuriated me, but it also filled me with uncertainty. Had I really seen the snakes? Everything had happened so fast in the middle of panic that now, standing in the relative safety of the camp, I began to doubt myself. Whatever happened, we can't ignore it, David intervened, taking control of the situation as a good leader should. If Amanda says she was locked in a cabin, we need to investigate. Someone or something is out there. There was a general murmur of agreement, but I could feel the tension in the air. Each of them, just like me, seemed to wonder if the danger came from within the group or from something external. That night, the camp wasn't the same. The fire, which used to be a space of relaxation and laughter, was now filled with tension. No one strayed from the circle of light provided by the fire, and the conversations were hushed, barely whispers. Despite the company, I felt completely isolated. My mind kept replaying what had happened in the cabin. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the face of the shadow in the doorway, heard the creak of branches outside, and the hissing of the snakes. As the night wore on, paranoia began to set in. I started watching each of the group members, trying to decipher if any of them had been behind what had happened to me. Tomas kept making sarcastic comments as if trying to downplay everything. Maybe it was his way of dealing with fear, or maybe he was trying to distract us from something. Then there was Sarah, always so attentive and worried. Too worried, I thought. Could she be acting? And David, he was the one who had rescued me, but how sure could I be that he didn't know more than he was saying? The fire flickered, casting dancing shadows on the trees around us. From time to time, the wind would carry the sound of distant branches creaking, and every time it did, we all seemed to tense up in unison. The tranquility we had felt at the beginning, that sense of adventure, had completely vanished. Now, only fear remained. What if someone lives in this forest? Claudia, one of the younger girls in the group, suddenly suggested. Her voice trembled slightly, as if she were saying aloud what we all feared to think. It's possible, David replied, frowning. It's a very isolated place, but we haven't seen any signs of life nearby. No one mentioned that cabin when we planned this trip. Well, someone was close enough to lock Amanda in there, Sarah added, her voice barely a whisper. The tension in the group became palpable. We all looked at each other, trying to read something in each other's faces. Could one of us have been responsible for what had happened? Pedro, a strong guy who hadn't shown any signs of fear until now, but whose tone betrayed his unease, suddenly spoke up. Maybe we should all stick together tomorrow. Let's not be paranoid, but we can't keep acting like nothing happened. David nodded, assuming his role as leader. Agreed. Tomorrow we'll explore the area and try to find out more about that cabin. We won't let anyone separate from the group. That night, despite being surrounded by people, I couldn't sleep. The wind that blew through the trees sounded like whispers, as if the forest itself was conspiring. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt as if something or someone was watching me. Finally, I got out of my tent and approached the fire where some of the guys were still awake, taking turns to keep watch. Tomas looked at me from across the fire, his eyes half closed. Do you still think someone from the group locked you in there? His question caught me off guard. I don't know, I admitted, looking at the ground. I don't know what to think. It's strange, isn't it? We've been together the whole time, he continued, his usual sarcastic tone now absent. But if it wasn't someone from here, who else could it be? I had no answer for that. I only knew that the idea of someone in our own group being responsible terrified me more than anything else. How could you coexist with someone who might have tried to harm you? The next morning, the camp was quiet. No one talked much while we had breakfast. David suggested we go investigate the cabin, but something inside me resisted. I didn't want to go back to that place, but I knew we had to. We needed answers. We ventured into the forest, following the same path I had taken the day before. With every step I took, my heart pounded harder. The air felt thicker and the trees darker. When we finally reached the cabin, everything was exactly as I had left it. The door slightly ajar, the interior shrouded in shadows. David was the first to go inside. There's nothing here, he said after a quick inspection. No signs of snakes. I felt the ground crumble beneath me. How is that possible? Had I imagined it all? No, it couldn't be. I was sure of what I had seen. Claudia approached me slowly, her eyes filled with fear. Amanda. "Are you sure you saw snakes?" "I'm not crazy," I replied in a small voice. "Someone locked me in here and there were snakes. I know it." David examined the door, frowning as he noticed something. "Here it is. Look at this." On the other side of the door, on the ground, there was a heavy log, positioned in such a way that it could have been used to jam the door from the outside. "This is what kept you from getting out." The group gathered, all staring at the log in silence. The questions were clear on their faces. Who had put it there? And why? The discovery of the log sent a cold shock through everyone. It wasn't just that something strange had happened. Someone had actually tried to keep me inside that cabin. The atmosphere grew heavier, as if a dark cloud had descended over the group. No one spoke, but we all shared the same silent question. Who? David lifted the log easily, but his gaze remained fixed on me. He didn't say anything, but his eyes told me that he understood the gravity of what had happened. It wasn't a misunderstanding nor a simple coincidence. Someone had placed that log there with the intention of trapping me inside. But why? And more disturbingly, who among us, or perhaps someone else, was behind all this? "This doesn't make any sense," murmured Sarah, breaking the silence. "Why would someone do this?" No one had an answer. Nervous glances were exchanged between the members of the group. I could feel the distrust beginning to take hold of each of us. We were no longer the united group venturing into the forest together. Now everyone was suspecting one another. Tomas approached the log, examining it with curiosity. "Anyone could have done it," he commented, his tone even more distant than usual. "But I don't see why anyone from the group would want to lock you in there, Amanda. Maybe it was someone from outside, some crazy person living in this forest." His comment made my skin crawl. The idea that someone could be out there, watching us from the shadows, terrified me even more than the possibility that one of my companions was the culprit. But then something struck me. The man I saw at the door, the figure that stopped, cracked the door open and then left. Had it been one of my friends playing a twisted joke, or was someone else really lurking in the forest? Nico and I had been stealth camping since our college days, when adventure was more affordable than a motel room and much more exciting. Over the years, we had perfected our skills, mastering the art of disappearing into the margins of parks, green strips, and forgotten lands. It became our thing, a way to travel light, save money, and have a story to tell. And if I'm honest, the scariest thing we'd encountered was an overly curious raccoon trying to get its paws into our food stash. We prided ourselves on being smart, cautious, and above all, invisible. But there was one night, just one time, that still gives me chills every time I think about it. We were on a road trip through the Pacific Northwest, a route we had planned to visit as many national parks and forests as possible. We spent our days hiking trails, relaxing by lakes, and enjoying the beauty of it all. At night, we'd find some quiet, hidden spot, set up camp, and settle in. That night was no different from any other. We arrived in a small town that seemed not to have changed in decades, just rows of aging shops, a gas station, and old houses sagging under the weight of time. It was late summer, warm and dry, with the sky clearing to reveal a few stars as well. Nico suggested we head to a public park on the outskirts of town. From the road, it looked perfect. Lots of trees, a creek running through it, and best of all, no one else around. We parked in a gravel lot near the entrance, grabbed our hammocks, and followed a narrow trail that ran alongside the creek. It led us to a small clearing surrounded by massive fir trees. The branches were thick enough to block most of the light, tinting everything in shades of deep blue and black. There was only one sign of civilization. A twisted wooden fence, half rotted and covered in vines, barely visible through the trees. It seemed to mark someone's property line, but there were no lights, and we definitely didn't see a house. Maybe it was abandoned. Whatever it was far enough away that we didn't worry. We found a spot a little off the trail, hung our hammocks, and prepared for a quiet night under the stars. We ate a quick dinner, some sandwiches and fruit, and then lay together in the larger hammock, watching the sky through the gaps in the branches. The only sounds around us were the gentle murmur of the creek, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful. We had done this so many times that I didn't even think twice about it. Stealth camping was second nature to us by now. We must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was blinking in the darkness. My first thought was that maybe I had heard something subtle but out of place. I stayed still and listened, but all I could pick out were the usual sounds of the night. I was about to dismiss it when I felt Nico stir beside me. "Hey, did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, though I still hadn't heard anything specific. His voice was low and tense, the kind of whisper that sets your nerves on edge. "What is it?" I asked, barely daring to breathe. "I've been hearing footsteps for a while," he replied. That woke me up quickly. I strained my ears and finally caught it, a faint shuffling sound, almost as if someone was dragging their feet. It was slow and deliberate, definitely not an animal. My heart began to pound in my chest as I scanned the darkness around us. The trees cast long shadows that seemed to move with every gust of wind. Then, in the pale light filtering through the branches, I saw movement. A hunched figure staggered between the trees. It was an older woman, her hair disheveled and matted, her clothes hanging like loose rags. She moved erratically, taking a few steps forward, then back, her arms hanging limply at her sides. For a moment I thought she was lost or confused, maybe having wandered off from somewhere nearby. But there was something about the way she moved, something jerky and unnatural, almost as if she were being pulled by invisible strings. We didn't dare make a single sound. We just lay there watching as she staggered closer, her face barely visible in the dim light. I held my breath, hoping she would pass by and leave us alone. But she didn't. Instead, she stopped near one of the larger trees, glanced around nervously, and then crouched down as if trying to hide. She pressed herself against the trunk and went completely still. We lost sight of her. The silence that followed was suffocating. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what we had just seen. Who was that woman? Why was she here in the middle of the night, acting like that? And more importantly, where was she now? I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, just out of sight, watching us. Minutes passed slowly. I could feel the tension building in the air, thick enough to choke on. Nico's grip on my arm tightened. I could tell he was as scared as I was, but neither of us wanted to move until we were sure she was gone. Suddenly there was more movement, this time heavier, louder. Two men appeared, walking from the park toward the trees as if they knew exactly where they were going. They were dressed in dark, rough clothing, and the way they walked was purposeful and deliberate. They made my stomach twist with fear. They weren't out for a casual stroll. They were looking for something or someone. Nico and I huddled together, barely daring to peek over the edge of the hammock as the men got closer and closer. They stopped near the tree where the woman had hidden. I could hear them murmuring to each other, low and urgent, like they were arguing. One of them raised a hand and gestured toward the tree, and without warning, they started thrashing through the bushes, kicking at the undergrowth as they whispered furiously to each other. I covered my mouth with a hand, terrified they would hear my breathing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of them shouted something, and the woman came out of her hiding spot. She looked even more miserable up close, her body trembling as she stood. One of the men grabbed her arm and yanked her to her feet. She stumbled, barely able to stand. They didn't seem to care. They shook her and brushed the dirt off her clothes. One of them slapped her on the head hard enough to make her stumble. She didn't even cry out. She just cowered and kept her head down. "Keep an eye on her this time," one of them said in a raspy, cruel voice that sent a chill through my blood. They marched her back the way they had come, forcing her to walk between them as they headed toward the park. But before they left, they stopped and scanned the area, their eyes sweeping over the trees, the bushes. Us. I felt their gaze like a knife, even from a distance, searching for something or making sure no one was watching. Their eyes finally settled on our hammock. I thought my heart would stop completely. They stared at it, whispering to each other again, and for a terrifying moment, I thought they were going to come over and check it out. After a tense exchange, they shrugged and moved on, dragging the woman back into the shadows. We stayed frozen, barely daring to breathe until we were sure they were gone. My mind was racing with 100 different questions, none of which had good answers. Who were those guys? What were they doing with that woman? Why were they here in the middle of the night, dragging her around like that? As soon as they were far enough away, Nico and I hurried to break down our camp, our hands shaking as we packed up our gear as quickly as possible. Neither of us spoke. We didn't even dare turn on the flashlight. The whole time I kept expecting them to come back to find us and do God knows what. My chest was tight with fear, my breathing shallow and uneven. I had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. We ran back to the trail, and the night, which had once felt peaceful, now seemed much more threatening. When we reached the car, Nico fumbled with the keys, dropping them twice before finally unlocking the door. We got in, locked the doors, and sped out of there as if the devil himself were chasing us. It wasn't until we were halfway down the highway that we dared to talk about what had just happened. We decided we had to report it. I didn't know what to expect when I called the local police, but the response was lukewarm at best. The operator took our information, said they'd send someone to check it out, and that was it. No follow-up, no questions. I got the distinct feeling that they weren't surprised by what we had just described, as if it was just another incident on a long list of things they'd already seen. We didn't stick around to find out. We drove until we reached the next town and found a cheap motel. That night, we stayed up, going over the events in our heads, trying to make sense of it all. But the more we thought about it, the more unsettling it became. The blank eyes of that older woman, the way she moved like a puppet with loose strings, the cruelty of those two men. It was a living nightmare, one we could barely process. It wasn't just the strangeness of the situation that haunted us, but the implications. What would have happened if we hadn't stayed silent? What if we had tried to intervene or simply made our presence known? Those guys clearly weren't there to help her. They were controlling her somehow. Who knows what they were planning or how many other people they had helped before. Thinking about falling under their radar made me shudder. The next morning, with the sun shining as if nothing were wrong in the world but fear still clinging to us, we were quieter than usual as we packed up our things to hit the road. The radio played softly in the background, but it did nothing to dispel the tense weight hanging over us. It was Nico who finally broke the silence. "Do you think that was some kind of human trafficking?" His voice was low, like he didn't really want to hear the answer to that question. I shrugged, though I wasn't sure he was looking at me. Maybe, or something worse. I can't get her face out of my head. "Yeah," he paused, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. "But you know what bothers me even more?" I turned toward him, curious despite the fear gnawing at my gut. "What?" He kept his eyes on the road, but I could see the tension in his jaw. They saw us. They knew we were there, but they just left. It's like, I don't know, like they didn't care. That sent a fresh chill through me. He was right. They had definitely seen our hammock, made eye contact with us in the dark, and then just walked away. It was like they knew we wouldn't say anything or that we wouldn't be a problem. Or maybe they were confident that, even if we did, nothing would happen. Either way, it made me feel small, insignificant, like we had glimpsed something much bigger and more sinister than we could even comprehend. We didn't stop stealth camping after that. Like I said, it's our thing, and most of the time it's still the best way to sleep under the stars, far from prying eyes and overpriced campsites. But I'll admit, that night changed something in us. We're much more cautious now, more deliberate about where we camp, what we look for in a site, and how long we stay. Nico and I have this sort of unspoken rule now. If either of us feels the slightest bit uncomfortable about a place, we leave. No second guessing, no doubting our instincts. We trust each other implicitly because we've seen firsthand how things can go wrong, even in a place that seems safe. I still think about that night sometimes. Usually when we're lying in our hammocks, staring up at the stars, listening to the wind whispering through the trees. I wonder if that older woman ever got away, or if she's still out there, trapped in the dark world those men were part of. I wonder if anyone else has seen what we saw, or if they got too close and didn't make it out. In the end, I'm sorry. There's no real closure to our story. No comforting answer or neatly wrapped conclusion. Just a lingering sense of unease. A reminder that even in the quietest, most peaceful places, there can always be something sinister lurking just beyond the shadows. And that's the funny thing about stealth camping. It's all about staying hidden, slipping under the radar. But sometimes when you least expect it, you find out that you're not the only one hiding out there. And sometimes you're the one who ends up being found. I won't say my name, I can't. The shame of being judged haunts me. Traveling had always been my escape, my way of finding myself away from responsibilities, from routine, from everything. I love camping, being in touch with nature, and living the adventure firsthand. But that trip to Africa changed me forever. I had traveled to many places, but Africa was different. There was something about the idea of camping on such a vast continent, so full of life and mystery, that drew me in like a magnet. I spent weeks planning the trip, looking for hiking routes and remote places to camp. I didn't want to stay in a hotel or follow tourist routes. I wanted the real experience, unfiltered. Little did I know that this time my curiosity would lead me to the darkest side of humanity. After arriving in a small town and spending a couple of nights at an inn, I decided it was time to head into nature. I had read about a forest in the guides, a remote yet supposedly safe place. I set up my tent in a small clearing I found after walking for several hours. It was a peaceful spot, surrounded by tall trees that barely let the sunlight in, as if they were wrapping you in a silent embrace. The air was fresh and clean, and though I was alone, I felt at peace. The first night was perfect. I built a small fire and sat there contemplating the sky. The silence of the forest was so absolute that I could hear my own thoughts. I fell asleep to the sound of crickets and other nocturnal insects. I felt in my element. Everything was fine, or at least that's what I thought at the time. I didn't know that this feeling of tranquility would be the calm before the darkest storm of my life. The next day, after a quick breakfast, I decided to explore beyond the clearing where I had camped. The forest was beautiful, dense, but there was something in the air that felt different, a sense of heaviness, a silence that wasn't normal. I didn't notice it at first, but the deeper I ventured, the more intense that atmosphere became. It was as if the forest was trying to warn me of something, but I ignored it, convinced it was just my imagination. The trees seemed to close in on me, blocking more and more light. Each step I took led me deeper into a place that began to feel hostile. I heard a sound. It was like a distant murmur, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my skin crawl. I stopped, trying to listen more closely, but I couldn't identify it clearly. I felt uncomfortable, as if something was watching me from the thick forest. I tried to ignore the feeling and keep going, but the sound came back clearer this time. It was a murmur, a constant whisper, as if someone were speaking in low voices. I decided to follow the sound, driven by a mix of curiosity and nervousness. My heart was racing, and with every step I felt like I was crossing an invisible boundary. Finally, I reached a small hidden clearing among the trees, and what I saw left me completely paralyzed. There they were, a group of people, members of a tribe. They were gathered in a circle, focused on something I couldn't see clearly from my position. At first, I thought it was some sort of ritual, something typical of the local culture. But there was something off about the scene, something that didn't fit. I hid in the bushes, trembling but unable to look away. What initially seemed like a simple ritual soon transformed into a much more disturbing vision. The smell of blood came first. It was a metallic, strong scent that mixed with the smoke from a small fire and filled my nostrils to the point where I felt like vomiting. That's when I saw the two boys. They were tied to a pole, naked from the waist down, their bodies covered in blood. They were alive. I knew because of their faint, weak groans, barely perceptible, as if they no longer had the strength to scream. Their eyes were open, but empty, filled with indescribable fear. Tears ran down their cheeks, but they didn't scream, only letting out muffled groans of pain and terror. Their legs were completely torn apart, and the worst part was that they were still conscious as the tribe members tore pieces of flesh from them and ate it. Their faces showed a mixture of delight and concentration, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The sight was nauseating. I saw one of them bite into a leg, tearing the flesh with their teeth and ripping off a piece with a look of satisfaction. There was blood everywhere, dripping from the boys' open wounds as they slowly bled out. The sound of chewing, the crunch of bones breaking was the only thing heard in that clearing. I felt like I was in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I wanted to look away, but I was frozen, unable to move, unable to do anything but watch. My stomach twisted. I felt the acid rising in my throat, but I couldn't even vomit. My legs trembled uncontrollably, and the only reason I didn't run was because I was completely paralyzed by fear. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the blood grew even stronger. The smoke from the fire stung my eyes, but I couldn't pull away. I couldn't do anything but observe. The horror of what I was seeing was so overwhelming, so completely unreal, that my mind just shut down. At some point, one of the tribe members turned in my direction. Our eyes met for a second. I don't know if they actually saw me or if it was just my paranoia, but that instant was enough for my survival instinct to finally kick in. I slowly backed away, trying not to make any noise, but my foot hit a dry branch, and the crack sounded louder than I had imagined. The noise cut through the air like a gunshot. The murmurs stopped immediately. I felt their eyes on me even without daring to look back. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they could hear it too. I knew I couldn't stay a second longer. I turned and started running, my feet pounding the forest floor clumsily. The branches scratched my face, my arms, and with every step, I felt like I was going to fall. I ran as if my life depended on it because at that moment it truly did. The way back was hell. I didn't know exactly where I was running. I only knew I had to get as far away from that place as quickly as possible. My breathing was chaotic, interrupted by sobs and spasms of nausea. I vomited several times as I ran, but I couldn't stop. Every time I closed my eyes for a second, I saw those boys, their pale faces, their mutilated bodies, the sound of their flesh being torn by teeth. When I finally reached the camp, I collapsed on top of the tent, tearing it in the process. My hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't gather my things properly. Everything I did was a mess. Objects fell to the ground, scattered everywhere. I had no time, no calm, only panic. I stuffed what I could into my backpack, not caring if I was breaking or crushing anything, and ran to the car. The minutes it took to reach the vehicle felt like an eternity. Every noise in the forest seemed like a sign that they were following me, that they would catch me and drag me back to that place to do the same to me. I got into the car with my hands covered in dirt and blood from my falls and drove as fast as I could. I didn't look back, not once. It didn't matter if I had left something behind at the camp. I just wanted to get as far away as possible, as if the distance could erase the images now burned into my mind. I drove with trembling hands, cold sweat running down my face and my heart pounding in my chest so hard I could barely breathe. I couldn't stop crying. It was a cry mixed with fear, helplessness, and an overwhelming guilt I couldn't fully understand. The road was a blur. The trees passed by like dark shadows on both sides of the road, and my mind kept replaying the scene over and over again. Those boys, tied up, suffering while being eaten alive, their bodies still fighting to survive even though there was no hope left in their eyes. I couldn't shake their vacant stares, their pale skin, and the silent tears streaming down their faces. The pain they reflected was indescribable. I reached a gas station after what seemed like hours. I don't know how I managed to drive for so long without stopping sooner. I was covered in dust, sweat, and tears with a blank stare and a mind completely disconnected from reality. I got out of the car and collapsed by a gas pump, unable to stand. I vomited again, feeling like there was nothing left inside me, but the disgust and revulsion wouldn't go away. It was as if my body was trying to expel what I had seen, but nothing could get rid of it. People around me stared, but no one dared approach. I guess they were scared or simply didn't know what to do with someone in such a state of panic. I stayed there, sitting on the ground, breathing heavily and trying to pull myself together, though I didn't know if I ever really could. It was as if the world had lost all its color, all its meaning. There was only fear, disgust, and a deep pain I couldn't define. After a while, I got back into the car and drove to the nearest place I could find with a room. I didn't speak to anyone, I couldn't. I just asked for a room and locked myself in, sitting on the floor with my back against the door as if that could protect me from what I had seen. I couldn't stop crying. I couldn't stop feeling guilty. I had left those boys there. I hadn't done anything for them. I abandoned them. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same scene over and over again, like an endless loop of horror. The sounds of the forest blended in my mind with the groans of the boys and the crunching of their bones under the teeth of those monsters. I felt like I was reliving it all, trapped in that nightmare with no way out. I stayed awake, sitting in the darkness, trying to understand how something so horrible could be real. Days passed, and I couldn't shake the fear from my body. Every time I heard someone speak, I thought maybe they knew what I had seen, that maybe they were waiting for me to confess. But I couldn't. I couldn't talk about it with anyone. What would they think of me? How could I explain what I had witnessed without them judging me for doing nothing? I felt like a coward, useless, and every day that feeling dragged me deeper and deeper into a pit. I didn't know how to escape. Eventually, I returned to my country, trying to leave everything that had happened behind, but it wasn't that easy. The memories haunted me. Every time someone mentioned Africa, travel, or camping, I felt a lump in my throat that made it hard to breathe. No one knew what I had seen. No one knew why I had changed so much since I came back. I tried to move on with my life, but nothing felt the same. Everything seemed fake, meaningless compared to the brutality of what I had witnessed. The days turned into weeks, then into months. And although time buried the most vivid details of the memory, the essence of the horror remained, lurking ready to resurface at any moment. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night hearing the murmurs in my ears, or with the smell of blood stuck in my nose. There was no escape. It was as if part of me had stayed trapped in that clearing alongside those boys, suffering in silence. I can't talk about this with anyone, not even my closest friends. I can't bear the thought of them looking at me with disgust or judging me for not doing anything. Until today, I've kept this secret hidden deep in my mind because I don't want anyone to know who I am. I don't want anyone to see me the way I see myself. But by telling it anonymously, maybe I can release some of this weight, if only for a moment. This is the first time I've ever spoken about it. The first time I've put the horror I experienced into words. And even now, I feel like it's not enough to explain what it feels like to witness something like that. I don't expect anyone to understand. I don't expect anyone to forgive me. I only hope that no one ever has to live through what I did. Because once you see something like that, there's no going back. I went to camp every summer for most of my youth, even into my teenage years. My friends and I from school attended the same program, so we all became very close. It was like our little getaway because the camp we went to was outside our country, nestled in the beautiful rolling hills just across the border. It was something I looked forward to every year. I always traveled with the same organization from when I was 7 years old until I turned 18. My campmates and I spent a lot of time together on those road trips, singing and playing games to pass the time. Because of all that time spent together, it might not be too surprising what happened to us. We always traveled together as a group in buses to reach different camps and, of course, to go back and forth from our city. Now, this youth program was actually in Hungary, and I'm from Germany, so it was a very long trip, and we traveled at night. Around 1 in the morning, we stopped at a gas station on the highway. I was 11 years old at the time, once again with my summer camp friends, and I was very, very awake. We all went to the bathroom and then into the store at the gas station. We were all giggly and happy, you know how kids are during these trips. We wandered through the candy aisles, glanced at a corner of books, and then found a fridge with drinks we liked at the back. It was like a little midnight paradise for us kids, all the bright fluorescent lights and sweets in sight. However, while we were shopping, I remember hearing a very, very loud sound, like a large block of metal crashing onto the asphalt. I even felt the ground shake a little when we heard it. It came from somewhere outside the building, but it was still so loud that it caught everyone's attention for a moment, but nothing more. No one really asked about it. No one said, "What was that?" Nothing. We all just kept exploring that little roadside store, stretching our legs as much as we could for as long as possible. I remember everyone laughing a bit about it for some reason and returning to the bus without giving it much thought. We were just ready to continue the trip. When we got back to the bus, however, the energy was off. Everything felt weird. What had first been all laughter and smiles, kids playing in the dark, was now replaced by a kind of somber tension. No one seemed to be having fun anymore. In fact, every time the kids got a bit too loud, one of the counselors would come and tell them to quiet down. We all just slumped into our seats and waited for the bus to start moving again. I'd say after half an hour of nothing happening, we slowly realized that something was really wrong. There was a story going around about a child coming out of the woods ahead near that gas station. A large truck coming around the bend couldn't stop and hit him. The story we heard was that the road up ahead was covered in blood. Apparently, that child had appeared out of nowhere, tried to cross the highway, and the truck lost control, flipping over and killing him instantly. All the camp counselors seemed to be in a panic, whispering to each other and doing head counts over and over again. The next story told on the bus was that a couple of kids were missing from our list. One of them I knew personally from the camp program, as he and I had been attending forever. Suddenly I felt sick at the thought that he might be dead, mercilessly crushed on the road. Dark thoughts continued to torment me as the idea sank in. Maybe I would never see him again. Many of us just sat in silence while we waited to hear the news about what was really happening. No one was allowed to leave the bus. An ambulance was called to the scene, giving us all some hope. I think we waited there until early morning, around 5 or 6, when the sun was just starting to rise, revealing the truth of what had happened. The police were there and everything. We could see them working from the bus. They put caution tape everywhere, scattered teams working to clean up the broken glass and spilled oil on the road. It was surreal to see that scene so close. In the darkness of the night, the accident might as well have happened on the other side of the world. But with the sun, we could see it was actually just across the road from the gas station. Now that we had a clear view, the smell of everything began to fill the air. Throughout the night, we only sensed the aroma of the forest, but now I could smell the industrial metal, the cracked asphalt, the oil and burnt rubber, and of course I could smell the blood, that iron scent permeating the breeze. Many of us began to gag on the bus. Out of nowhere, the boy reappeared with an officer, the one who was rumored to have come out of the woods. He was the one we'd heard had been crushed, but here he was, apparently fine. He was one of the campers, not just some random kid who had come out of the woods. He had been walking behind the other two boys, the ones who were still missing. He explained that the truck had indeed skidded right in front of them, almost killing him. He wasn't sure if the others had survived. They took him to the hospital to get stitches, and now he wanted to continue the trip to camp. Instead, we were taken to a community center where we all gathered, and then we were told that the two boys who were missing were, in fact, dead. No one reacted at first, not even the boy who had survived, the one who had been with them. We all just stood there in silence, in shock. It was my friend and another boy from the program, one I didn't know personally. In a single moment of my life, my entire childhood changed forever. Summer camp was like a time of peace. Many of my best memories were directly tied to the very notion of packing up all my belongings and going away with my friends for a whole season to some far-off place. All those sleepless hours during the night waiting to hear who had died ruined anything good I had to remember. It turned out those boys had snuck off in the opposite direction when we stopped at the gas station. They were wandering around the forest, smoking cigarettes and just messing around. The boys got too close to the highway, and just as they stepped onto the road, a transport truck came speeding from the opposite direction. The brakes were failing, and the driver had been losing control little by little for a minute or two. He tried to swerve around them, and instead, the truck flipped over and crushed them into nothing. They didn't even have time to scream. They turned that community center into a sort of triage for the kids who had to stay there. There was a separate area for sleeping, with beds and pillows lined up, clean blankets to snuggle into. There was an office space they reconfigured after some psychologists arrived. A place to go and talk about what had happened if you were bothered, if you wanted to. They also had a rec room with movies playing on a television and board games in the back. It was weird. It made the news and everything, and I really don't like to think about it. I remember telling my parents that my brother and I were alive and well. In fact, we drove to Hungary to the camp after a day at that community center because most of the kids still wanted to go. Some kids literally had nowhere else to go. Even the boy who survived, who was the cousin of one of the dead boys, insisted on continuing the trip. Looking back, it's absolutely mind-boggling. Half of us were paralyzed by the trauma, and the other half didn't seem to care. They just wanted to carry on with their summer. If you didn't want to go, you had the chance to return home or call your parents to come and get you. At first, I didn't want to go. I was too devastated by my friend's death, but I eventually made the decision to go through with it. The trip back would be long, and the idea of sitting in my room alone for 3 months wasn't exactly a comforting thought. I decided that having a good summer to honor my friend might be a good, or at least better, way to start processing what had just happened. I went. It was actually a pretty good summer camp retreat because everyone there was going through the same thing I was. We had psychologists on site and everything, since some people's nerves started to break later on in the program. After the adrenaline and shock wore off, they broke down into depression. There were supposed to be 50 or 60 kids in total, I think, but in the end, there were fewer than half. Still, I think that year we shared a closer bond because of that incident. Almost every night, we cried together around the campfire. That doesn't mean there weren't strange occurrences that year as well. Some people claimed they saw and heard things no one had ever reported before. This was a very busy, well-respected summer camp, not some supposedly haunted retreat full of drug addicts and alcoholics. Seeing and hearing strange things was definitely out of the ordinary for this place. There was an incident where one night 2 of the girls came back from the bathroom screaming at the top of their lungs. They were younger, part of the elementary school group. It took us supervisors about 10 or 15 minutes to calm them down. By then, one of the senior counselors had come to help and was taking charge of the situation. Once they finally calmed down, They told us what had happened. It was dark and they both had to use the bathroom. They didn't want to walk alone since the bathrooms were a good distance away, so they decided to go together. While they were inside doing their business, someone started knocking on the outside of the bathroom, just single knocks. At first, the girls got scared but assumed it was one of the boys following them and playing a prank. When they left the bathroom, both of them claimed to see that dead boy standing at the start of the path. He waved at them and then ran off into the darkness. We ended up sending them to the therapist for the night, who just said it was a way of coping with that accident. Some people claimed that the knocks were a classic prank of the dead boy, that he used to do it every summer to some of the younger kids. Very strange stuff. Another boy claimed he was chased back to camp by a shadowy figure, one that kept calling his name. He had gone out to pee among the trees like boys do, and just as he picked a tree, someone came running out of the darkness. The figure literally said, "Boo!" and then started chasing him. The boy didn't even have time to pull up his pants. He just turned around and ran back to camp while the thing behind him kept saying things like, "You're fast, Anton," or "I'm going to catch you, Anton." When he got back to camp, he was pale as a ghost and babbling nonstop. He didn't even bother to pull his pants up or fix himself. We eventually managed to calm him down, and after he explained what happened, he ended up going to the therapist to deal with the trauma that was also affecting him. It was a long and somber summer that year, one that shook us all in the worst way. As I write this, I suppose I realize it traumatized me a lot more than I thought. Rest in peace, my friend.